Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Today we are starting off with information on coral reefs. Now, coral reefs fall under Module 1, Caribbean Society and Culture, under the topic Impact of Geographical Phenomena. Okay, and when you look at the syllabus, you will see where in the objectives, they expect you to assess the impact of geographical processes on Caribbean society and culture. And that is for all the other things that they mention, earthquakes and so on. But in this case, we are looking specifically at coral reefs. We're not looking at all the different geographical processes. And for coral reefs, the syllabus specify that we have to look at coastal protection, sustainability of the fishing industry. Okay, so let's start by what are the key questions that we need to answer for this topic. The first one is we need to be able to explain what are coral reefs. Again, for introductory material, we should be able to know the examples of reef in the Caribbean, because I keep telling you that whatever question you're writing, you will have to give examples. So we're going to start by looking at defining coral reefs very briefly. For the geography students or environmental students here, if there are any geography or environmental students and you have done this topic for those subjects, then this should be just a breeze through for you. Okay, so the first thing is explaining coral reef. The second one is the benefits of coral reef. We want to know how they contribute to Caribbean development. How do they contribute to Caribbean culture and society? What are the main threats to coral reef? And more importantly, how can we protect our coral reefs? And the sustainability is going to come under protecting our coral reefs. For the main threats, we're also talking about the impacts, the negative impact. So let's start. What is a coral? A coral is a sedimentary limestone rock made up of the skeletons of tiny marine organisms called coral polyps. Which is basically the basic unit of the coral reef. Coral reefs comprise colonies of marine organisms with both hard and soft bodies. Now, if you are a geography student and you get a question on coral and you want to explain it in a very geographical terms, that is fine as well. Okay, this is just a very basic explanation for the average student. If you think that you can't remember how to explain what is a coral from this, that's just Google it and find a simple, easy definition that you can remember when you go into an exam. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second one is what are the different types of reefs? Again, just background information. So there are three different types of reef. They are the barrier reef, the fringing reef, and the atoll reef. Okay, background information, introductory information. Location and distribution of corals. Coral reefs are located on hard platforms of rock at varying distances from they're relatively close to the shore. And it's very important for you to remember that, because if you remember that they're located relatively close to the shore, when you think about impact, you would think, well, okay, if these reefs are not far from the shore and you have hotels and you have tourists, then maybe it will have an impact on them. Coral reefs are located in tropical waters between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. In the Caribbean, both mainland and island countries have coral reefs. Okay, in the Caribbean, the reefs are well developed on the eastern side of the Caribbean islands, but we don't really find reefs in the waters of South American countries, Guyana and Suriname. They don't have coral reefs. And the reason for that is because they are large river deposits. The large rivers like the Demerara River in Guyana, it deposits large amounts of sediment. And because of the sediment, it prevents the growth of corals, which we'll be talking about a lot later. What is needed for coral growth? Sunlight, clear, clean salt water. So again, think if we need clean salt water and our waters are polluted, then that might have an impact on the coral. Shallow water, hard surface, high oxygen concentration, and warm temperatures. And all this is just background information. So if you get a question on coral, well, you will get a question on coral. You might want to remember some of these to put to start off your to put in your introduction. Before I go into the other questions, I just want to use the Belize Barrier Reef as one of the case studies, because it is one of those reefs that you could use as examples for your different points. It is the largest barrier reef in the Northern Hemisphere. It is inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1996. And it is listed as a national park and marine reserve. Okay, so it is protected. It is supposed to be protected as a World Heritage Site. What does it mean as a World Heritage Site? It means that the government of Belize has a responsibility to ensure the sustainability of the reef through policies and laws and so on, different mandates and so on. It is the largest reef complex in the Atlantic Caribbean region, and it is the second largest reef system in the world. Okay, so the Belize Barrier Reef, if you have not already read about it, is one of those reefs that you can use as an example when you're talking about the different points that we'll be coming up to. The Belize Barrier Reef has a total of 178 different types of plants, over 500 species of fishes. Okay, 70 different types of hard corals and 36 different types of soft corals. So it is a very significant reef, coral reef system. It is a very significant ecosystem in the Caribbean area, in this region. You have numerous endangered species which are protected within the boundaries of the barrier reef, the Belize Barrier Reef. Things such as the West Indian manatee, the American crocodile, and 3 species of sea turtle. Okay, it is used as a global maritime laboratory. So you have people from all over the world, biologists, marine biologists from all over the world, who come to study different plant lives or different species of fishes or whatever it is within that ecosystem. So it is very, very important to the Caribbean. Now, the Belize Barrier Reef is of utmost economic importance to Belize. Okay, so because of the reef and the mangrove, it generates income from tourism. In fact, tourism contributed an estimated US 150 million to 196 million to the national economy in 2007. Okay, so that is 12 to 15% of the GDP of the country. Oops, sorry. So that alone tells you how significant. So if you get a question about the importance of the reefs, the coral reefs, and you're talking about economic importance, this is a good example to use. It contributes 12 to 15% of Belize GDP. It is also very important because of fission. Fission is an important cultural tradition, and it accounts for the livelihood of many coastal villages in Belize. And the annual economic benefits from reef and mangrove dependent on fishing is estimated to be between US $14 to $16 million. Okay, the reefs and mangroves also protect coastal properties from erosion and from being damaged by waves. And that because of the protection that it gives, they prevent damage worth 231 to 347 million a year. So this is just some very good examples to use to show the importance of the coral reefs. So when we're talking about importance, any question that you get on importance of coral reefs, you can use Belize Barrier Reef as your example. Okay? Okay, so what are the benefits of coral reefs? The first one is coral reefs are important to Caribbean society and culture because they bring international recognition to a country. So if you get an essay asking for the benefits or the importance of coral reefs or the impact of coral reefs, anything along that line, these are the points that you are going to have to help you write your essay. And the first one is that it brings international recognition to a country. Of course, the perfect example is the Bailey's Barrier Reef, which is a UNESCO heritage site, which basically, I said it before, it's the largest coral reef system in this part of the world. You have so many different types of corals and fishes and so on. It is a global marine laboratory for research. And what is interesting about the Bailey's Barrier Reef is that it continues to attract biologists, marine biologists from all over the world, because it is believed that 80% of the living organisms on the reef are still not discovered, have not been discovered. Okay, so when we're talking about international recognition, we can use Bailey's Barrier Reef as a good example. Coral reefs, the second importance or benefit of coral reefs. Coral reefs are important to Caribbean society and culture because they are valuable for the sustainability of the tourism industry. And when we expand on this point, we are going to talk about ecotourism. Ecotourism is basically tourism that is directed towards the natural environment. And we're going to talk about how tourism contributes to the economy of the different countries where you have reefs. In this case, the example is of Belize again. You can use for whichever countries like Jamaica, Tobago, and so on, you can use the examples that are familiar to you. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, all those countries, use examples that are familiar to you. But basically, you are focusing on ecotourism. When we talk about ecotourism, we're talking about tourists coming in to visit the coral reefs, not for academic purposes, but more for sporting purposes. So things like snorkeling and scuba diving. Okay. And again, the best example is the Bailey's Barrier Reef, where many tourists visit to scuba dive. And you can mention that you have dive shops that are located in those areas. Another example could be the Boca Reef in Tobago. And you can talk about the glass bottom boats that take tourists to the reef. So it also generates employment in that area. And in this case, it's not just international tourists. It's also local tourists coming from Trinidad. Okay, so the second value importance was the sustainability of the tourism industry, specifically ecotourism. The third benefit or importance of the reef is coral reefs are important to Caribbean society and culture because they provide employment opportunities for Caribbean people. Okay, how do they do this? Employment in terms of fishing. So the fishing industries are worth millions of dollars in some territories, such as St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, Belize, and Jamaica. Okay, some of the smaller villages depend on fishing for a source of income. Example, Castara and Charlottesville in Tobago. So you do have employment being generated through the fishing industry. And when we're talking about the fishing industry, when you have to expand on this point, you can talk about both small scale fishing, like the prominence of these smaller villages, fishing villages that I just mentioned, Castara and Charlottesville, or you can talk about commercial fishing, where there's fishing for export, okay? And what we find happening is a lot of the larger companies, they will purchase fish from the small fishermen and they will then export it. So you generate foreign exchange and revenue through the exportation of fishing. So that whole export fishing industry is a source of revenue for the countries. And you have the examples throughout the Caribbean. And when you're thinking about fishing and you're thinking about employment, think about all those islands that are very small, or all those islands that don't have resources like oil and gas and bauxite and so on, and they depend on fishing. Okay, some of the species that are exported that have large export markets are crab, lobster, and conchs. So you see where the point is, it is important because they provide employment opportunities for Caribbean people. Okay, now the fourth importance of value, coral reefs offer protection for Caribbean coastlines. Okay, coral reefs deflect strong wave energy. There's a typo there, it's supposed to be offer. Coral reefs deflect strong wave energy where they act as offshore breakwaters. So they protect the coastline from high energy waves. And if high energy waves are not coming into the coastline, they will prevent or they decrease the possibility of erosion. Okay, they act as a buffer between the waves and the shorelines. And they therefore reduce the effect of destructive waves. They protect beaches that are turtle nesting grounds. And they are also important for the development of other coastal landforms because they deflect strong wave energy approaching the coast. So they provide, for example, they supply beach material. So when we're talking about protection from the coastline, think as a buffer. You have waves, you have the shore, and you have these corals there that slows down or that act as a buffer between the two, thereby making sure that high energy waves don't come onto the directly, don't hit the shoreline directly, and therefore prevents destruction of the shoreline. Okay, so we're talking about that. Coral reef offer protection for Caribbean coastlines. The fifth point, coral reefs are important because they bring a sense of identity to Caribbean people. How does it do this? They allow people to feel a sense of pride in their natural environment, national and natural environment. And it promotes patriotism and nationalism. Talk to people from Belize or from Tobago, especially those who work on the reef, and you will see the sense of pride that they have in their reefs. Okay? In some countries, students at primary and secondary schools are taught about coral reefs to encourage appreciation and to help them to understand why it is important for us to conserve the reefs. So the reefs are seen as a valuable part of a country's natural heritage. And think again of Belize Barrier Reef. It is a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO Heritage Site. And there's some examples here. Other than the Belize Barrier Reef, we have the Boca Reef in Tobago, Devil's Reef in Jamaica, and the Gardens of the Queen in Cuba. So when we're talking about sense of identity, we're talking about that feeling of pride and patriotism and nationalism, that you know you belong to a country with these beautiful reefs, so you work on the reefs. And one of the ways in which that is encouraged is through education at primary and secondary school. So, for example, I mean, not even at secondary, if you do geography, you would learn about the reefs and so on. But in many of the countries at the primary school, they would learn about the reefs and social studies. Okay, especially the coral reefs are a big part of their natural heritage, natural environment. So coral reefs are important because they bring a sense of identity to Caribbean people. Now, how many points do they have? 5. Okay. What are the main threats to coral reefs? You know, what are the threats? Why is it that we're so afraid that we are damaging the reefs? Coral reefs are under threat worldwide. Okay, so the Caribbean is not the only place where the reefs are threatened. It is something that is happening all over the world. And in fact, there have been a major decline in Caribbean reefs. And I can use Boca Reef in Tobago as an example. Some researchers have estimated a loss of over 75% of living reefs since 1980. That is 3/4 of the living reefs in the Caribbean since 1980. Okay, so if those statistics, if we continue to see such a high loss of the living reefs, then we will very soon don't have any living reefs available or present in the Caribbean. And as I said, in Boca Reef and Tobago, we have seen where the reefs have been damaged, the reef have been destroyed over the years through a variety of activities, and where there are now attempts to try to conserve it and to give it time to build back itself and develop. So every day we see where the reefs are threatened by both human and natural factors. And I have the example there of Boca Reef and Tobago. And when we're talking about those factors, we're talking about a variety of things. You know, the diagram summarizes it very simply, where you have storms and global warming and the lionfish. There have been a lot of advertisements since last year here in Trinidad and Tobago, where we have been encouraging fishermen to fish for the lionfish, to capture the lionfish. Sediment oversupply, natural predators, pollution, the removal of mangroves, tourism and leisure, and so on. And warm ocean temperatures, there have been a lot of things that threaten the reefs. Let's look at some individually. The first one is overfishing. And this is specifically important to us in the Caribbean because so many of the countries in the Caribbean depend on fishing for an income. So many villages, a large percentage of the population in many of the smaller islands, they depend on fishing. Fishing is one of the main economic activity. But overexploitation or overfishing can be a major threat to the reefs. Okay? Overexploitation and decline in catches occurring within the Caribbean as a result of increasing demands for reef fish. So we have a demand in countries where the tourism industry is very big. There's always a high demand for things like lobsters, for example. And reef fishes are one of the main inshore fisheries within the Caribbean. So because of the demand, it's one of the main ones that you have fishermen trying to get in. Things like lobsters tend to sell for a high price. And when these are over harvested, or when there is overfishing and we take off too many of them, it affects the whole balance of the ecosystem. Okay, it affects the balance of the food chain, and the entire ecosystem becomes threatened. So then we would see decline in abundance, size, and the reproductive output of species. You will have changes in sex ratio, behavior, and distribution. So overfishing really and truly affects the entire ecosystem. And when that happens, it threatens the reef, because we need to have balance in the ecosystem to ensure that the reefs are preserved. Okay, let me go to the next one. So the first one I had was overfishing. The second one is harmful fishing practices. Okay, so the first one is when we fished for too much of the same species of fish. And the second one is the practices, the way in which we fish. So harmful fishing practices such as the use of dynamite and cyanide to catch the fish. They destroy the habitat for fish, and they reduce the biodiversity that is needed for the maintenance of a healthy reef. And well, this overfishing can reduce beneficial species, which keep predators that eat coral reef under control. So what we find happening is that when we destroy the habitat, which is also done through overfishing. Actually, I should put that point on overfishing in the slide before, so I'll do that. So let's leave that. And let's just talk about harmful fishing practices, such as the use of things like dynamite. And when we do that, we are literally interrupting the entire habitat for the fish. When we do that, we are making sure that the reef is, in most cases, there's direct damage to the reef. In some cases, it just affects the whole ecosystem and the biodiversity that is needed to maintain a healthy reef. Okay, think about it. If you put a piece of dynamite in the sea and you blow it up with the hope that the fishes would come up or you'd catch the fishes, you are damaging what is there. And that is a direct damage to the reef. So we have to be very careful about that. Another thing that we have to be very careful about is tourism, because tourism actually have a very negative impact on the reefs. So when we're talking about tourism, we're talking about things like careless boating, diving, snorkeling, and fishing, which can have severe impact on the ecosystem or that are sensitive to coral reefs. When tourists are snorkeling, they may occasionally walk on the coral, which may cause pieces to break up. And this is the problem that we had with the Bucca Reef in Tobago. In the 1980s, 1990s, the glass bottom boat will stop above the reef, and they will allow the tourists to come out, and they would walk on the reef, and it damaged the reef because it broke up the corals. Okay, people touching the reefs, stirring up sediment, collecting corals, dropping anchors on the reef. All these pose a threat to the health of the Caribbean's corals reef. Some tourist resorts and infrastructure have been built directly on reefs, and some tourist resorts empty their sewage or other waste directly in water surrounding the coastal reefs, which lead to which directly damage the reefs. Tourism is the greatest industry in the Caribbean, and increasing numbers of visitors have contributed to rapid and poorly planned coastal development. So every so often you would see in different countries where they are building all these resorts on the coast because they want direct access to beaches, or they want private beaches, or they want, all the beachfront property that you see. And when that happens, when you have hotels and you have all this coastal development, it leads to sedimentation and it leads to pollution. And pollution could damage the reefs. It is estimated that approximately 15% of coral reefs in the Caribbean are damaged from pollution from ships. Okay, when you have the selective removal of coral for souvenirs or for aquarium retailers, some of them collect it so they could go and sell it, or they could use it as ornament in their aquariums. When you have that, you are damaging the reef. So tourism is not exactly as, while it might bring in revenue for so many countries, it is not a good thing for the reef, not when we allow tourists to go on the reefs directly. Okay. The next way in which the reef is threatened is through sedimentation. And sedimentation is the removal of sand from beaches and coastal areas for use in the construction industry. So I just mentioned about all those beachfront property. When you are constructing beachfront property, you might be digging up the area, you might be using heavy equipment, and all these will loosen the sediment. And where does that sediment end up? In the sea. If it's near to a coastal, if it's on the fringe of the coastal reefs, it ends up on the corals. On the coral reef, it ends up on the corals. What happens then is that it smothers the coral reef and it deprives them of sunlight. And if you remember in the beginning, I showed you a slide with all the things that we need, that corals need to survive. And sunlight is one of the things that coral need to survive. So when you have sediment settling on the corals, the sunlight is not going to hit these corals directly, and it makes it difficult for them to survive. When we have the destruction of mangrove forests for the construction of buildings and so on, that also poses a threat, because again, the mangrove would have normally trapped the large amount of sediments, but when you no longer have mangroves, it means that the sediment goes into the sea directly. So all these things, all these practices of coastal development and removal of mangrove forests and soil erosion and so on, eventually the sediment ends up on the coral and it suffocates the coral, it smothers the coral, and it prevents the sunlight from reaching the coral directly. Okay, and it can kill the coral. So sedimentation is a major threat to coral reefs in the Caribbean. I just mentioned mangroves, but I want to list mangrove as a separate point. One of the biggest threat to coral reefs is the removal of mangroves from along the coast. They're very harmful to corals because of a variety of things. One, they reduce the runoff of polluted water entering the sea and serve as a nursery for species of reef fish. Two, mangroves may be removed for the construction of hotels, houses, factories, airports, and other facilities, which also result in sediment entering the sea. And raw, untreated sewage from these developments may also enter the sea, resulting once more in coral death. So mangroves, we could probably say that mangrove acted as a buffer. Okay, and the mangroves again is part of the natural ecosystem. And when we damage any part of that natural ecosystem, it is going to have an impact on another part of the ecosystem because they all need to work in tangent with each other. And when we damage one part, we are threatening, we are going to let it be a threat to the other parts, to the other aspects of the ecosystem. Okay, number 6, one of the greatest threats to coral reefs is the impact of global climate change. Okay, is the threat of global climate change. When we're talking about global climate change, we are talking about global warming, for example. Okay, when there is global warming, there's an increase in sea levels. So there's a rise in sea levels. And this affects, anything that happens in the sea affects the ecosystem. It's all, everything, as I said, is related to the other. So we see where coral reefs have a specific range of tolerance. That is, they must have access to sunlight, and rising water levels can change the extent to which sunlight can hit the reefs directly. Okay. We also, in the beginning, when I showed you the conditions necessary for the growth of corals, one of them was shallow water. When you have rising sea levels, the water gets deeper. And because of that, you don't have as direct access to sunlight as you would normally have. Climate change also leads to things like changes in rainfall, increased coastal erosion, a possible increase in the number and severity of hurricanes and tropical storms. And all these will affect the corals. All these affects the reefs. Across the Caribbean, coral cover is reduced by 17% on average in the year following a hurricane impact. So every time we have tropical storms and we have hurricanes, they can damage the coral reefs. Okay, and I mean 15% reduction is quite high. As a result, an increased number and severity of hurricanes will be detrimental to Caribbean coral reefs. Increased erosion, which is predicted, will impact the clarity and water quality on which the reefs depend. So one of the things you should do is you should go back to the slide in the beginning that showed all the things that corals need to be able to survive. And then you can understand why global warming is such a threat to coral reefs, while hurricanes and tropical storms or the increase in rainfall is such a threat to coral reefs. Okay, why rising water levels can affect coral reefs. So once you understand that, you would be able to write it in a way that, once you understand it, you can write it in the way that you understand best. Let me put it that way. Okay. Continuing on the same point, corals require an optimal water temperature to survive. That was also in the slide at the beginning. It needs a certain water temperature to survive. And if exceeded, coral species will become extinct. One consequence of climate change is the increase in global water temperature. Global warming has already led to increased levels of coral bleaching, and this is predicted to increase in frequency and severity in the coming decades. Ignore that's 19, a typo again. So global warming will affect the corals directly because corals can only survive in specific water temperatures. And coral bleaching, which is the whitening of corals due to the loss of symbiotic algae, is a response that can be triggered by a variety of stresses, including things like solar radiation and so on, sedimentation, disease, temperature increases. All these things lead to coral bleaching. Okay, so when we're talking about climate change, we have a lot of things that we can use to explain it. So you can pick out the points, the sub-points for this, and that you want to focus on, and you can focus on that when you explain in global climate change. Unless, of course, the entire question is how global climate change may affect the may impact on coral reef. Then you will need all the points. So in addition to those 6 points, there are some shorter points as well. Land-based sources of pollution and sediment threaten approximately 35% of corals in the Caribbean. So pollution from hotels, pollution from ships, pollution from all those yachts that you would see anchor off near the corals. All of those threaten corals and the growth of coral. Okay. When we remove coral reefs are removed physically for construction of deep water harbors, jetties, and marinas, that is a major threat to coral. And really and truly, most of the Caribbean countries would have put things in place to prevent that from happening, to prevent, constructing deep water harbors and jetties and so on near to coral reefs. But if countries have not done that and it happens, then you have a major threat to coral reefs in the Caribbean. Okay? How can we protect our coral reefs? So all the problems that we see, they're numerous. There are many, many threats to our coral. How then could we protect them? We can protect them through education and outreach programs for the public as well as for all stakeholders. This word stakeholders refer to everybody who works in that industry, in tourism, in the Ministry of Fission, and all those persons who work on anything near to concerning the reefs or the wider area of coast. And we need to have education and outreach programs targeting all groups involved in the reefs. And the reason for that is that we want to be able to tell the persons what exactly they can do. So if, for example, scientists and resource managers do, if they do research, or if scientists do research, they can inform the public, they can inform hotels, they can inform fishermen, and that is when we can really start to help. So education will help in resource management. Okay, education will help people to understand the importance of the corals. And that is why, as I mentioned earlier, you have in the primary and secondary school curriculum, you're taught about the reefs in countries where the reefs are very important. Okay, so schools outreach programs on the value of the reefs, for example, would help to teach the younger generations to appreciate the reefs, to understand the importance of the reef, to help them to have better practices if they visit the reefs. So when we teach people, we also reduce the human caused stresses or the negative human impact on the reef. And through education and outreach programs, what we normally find happening is that we basically educate people about good practices when it comes to coral reefs. So A simple thing might be, you know, you're taking a group of tourists on a tour of the reef, and before they board the boat, they're told about the reef. They're given a history of the reef, and they're told, well, we are not allowed to break off the corals, or we're not allowed to step on the corals. You shouldn't be doing those things because you can have a negative impact on the reef. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, education and outreach programs and so on. The second thing that we need to do to really conserve, to protect our reefs, is to maintain a balance in the ecosystem. What do we mean by that? We mean that we want everything within that coral reef, within that ecosystem, to work as it is meant to. We don't want to disrupt the cycle. We don't want to do things like destroy our mangroves. Okay, so we don't want to cut down the mangroves because we want to build a couple of hotels along that area or anything like that. Because when we do that, then we are affecting the reef animals and all the different species that live on the corals, or the different species of corals. So everything becomes is on an imbalance when we interfere with one part of the ecosystem. So when we say maintain a balance in the ecosystem, we mean this limit destruction to the mangroves. We mean prevent overharvesting of different species of fishes, such as the reef parrotfish and the sea urchins, because they feed on excess algae. And when they do that, they make sure that the reefs, the corals can survive. Okay, so we want to make sure that all the stakeholders associated with the ecosystem understands that everything is interconnected, so that when they are planning how they will manage the reefs, so when they're planning how they will manage the fishing industry, they will be able to take protective measures because they understand that it is a complete ecosystem, and that when you mess with one part of the ecosystem, the entire ecosystem could possibly collapse. The third one is we want to develop sustainable fishing practices. So we want to regulate the fishing industry. When we regulate the fishing industry, we want to make sure that you don't have overfishing, that you don't have illegal fishing. You want to educate the fishermen on the value of the reefs. Okay, and that this little diagram there shows sustainability of the fishing industry. So you strengthen marine protected area. This includes marine management and fiscal budget. You make sure that part of your budget actually goes towards sustainable fishing practices. Okay, you develop and expand fish sanctuaries and protected areas. You improve fisheries management, review, amend, and enact legislation and regulation, increase monitoring and enforcement. So it's one thing to tell fishermen, well, you know, we don't want you overfishing near the reef, or we don't want you overfishing, or we don't want you fishing illegally. But it's another thing to actually monitor who is fishing where and what is happening in terms of illegal fishing and overfishing. So unless you have legislation and regulation, or unless you have some kind of monitoring structure or process in place, then you would not be able to curb things like overfishing and illegal fishing. Okay, sustainable fishing industry, sustainability of the fishing industry also means you diversify your economy. You provide alternative livelihood for fishermen in areas where stocks are depleted. So if the fishermen in Castara are finding that, you know, they have to go further and further out at sea to actually get fishes, then you might start to investigate and you might try to figure out what is happening. Should we now tell them that instead of fishing in area A, they should be fishing in area B? And all that comes from research. All that comes from the government putting things in place to regulate the fishing industry. Okay, so when we're talking about develop sustainable practices, we need to note that once we have sustainable fishing practices, we will encourage the growth of corals and the sustainability of the coral reefs. Our next one, which leads directly to the point I was just talking about, is that the government must have laws and policies to prevent the destruction of coral reefs. How do we do this? Government can regulate visits to the reefs. So, and I'm talking tourism here. They can ban walking on the reefs. And I mentioned in the beginning that this is something that was done with the Buca Reef in Tobago. That in up to the 1990s, you could have walked on the reefs. You could have come out and you could walk. And because it was breaking up the reefs so much, the corals so much, it is now prevented. Okay. Government can pass laws prohibiting persons from breaking off the corals as souvenirs. Laws designated coral reefs as protected areas. Laws regulating coastal development on the fringe of reefs. So we need to have, in countries where coral reefs can be found, government need to have laws and policies in place to prevent the destruction of those reefs. And these are examples of some that can be done. Okay, another thing that can be done is encourage scientific research and the sharing of knowledge of coral reefs. And this is very important because the Caribbean countries may not have the resources to do scientific research on their reefs. But there are barrier reefs, well, there are reefs all over the world. And in places like Australia, for example, with the Great Barrier Reef, there's a lot of conservation groups and NGOs and other stakeholders who are involved in research, scientific research on the ecosystems. We have marine biologists working on different aspects of species that can be found and so on. So if you have that kind of sharing of knowledge with Caribbean countries as well as within the Caribbean, then that can help us to protect our reefs. So conservation groups such as Canary and World Wildlife Fund are making efforts to prevent or minimize impact of human use of coastal areas. Okay, remember, once you have tourists and you have hotels and so on the coastal areas that are near to the reef, it can impact negatively on the reefs. In some cases, active restoration is occurring in order to repair damaged areas. Research into the effects of pollution and resultant efforts are being made to reduce impacts of pollution and coral disease. Okay, that's another typo, sorry. Efforts are also being made to improve management of coral reef fisheries, which is an important component in the protection and restoration of coral reef ecosystem. And we also see where scientists are working to increase local managers' ability to respond to chloral bleaching. Okay, so that we can make sure that we have healthier coral reefs in the face of climate change. So all these things can actually help us to protect our coral reefs in the Caribbean. And it is very important that we understand the importance of the reefs in order to be able to protect the reefs. If the reefs are not seen as important, then you wouldn't have people making an effort to protect them. So it's a two-step process. One step is to educate people about the importance of the reefs. And the second step is to develop strategies to protect them. Okay, so with that in mind, we're now going to go and look at some of the questions. Describe the value of coral reefs to Caribbean society and culture. Suggest recommendations that may alleviate the problems and increase the sustainability of coral reefs. And how can coral reefs help in sustainable development in the Caribbean? I'm gonna give you a couple of minutes to just write down those questions because I'm gonna stop sharing my screen in a bit.